Surveys. You guys have already experienced surveys when you looked at the social psychology website. I imagine that you filled out some surveys. What can I tell you about this week? I had a job interview on Monday. I turned them down. Um, it was not as not a very good situation. I didn't think so because I didn't think that their IT was very strong, and I thought they needed to upgrade, and they didn't seem to be willing to allow me to work online, which doesn't make any sense at all in this day and age. But they were pushing for accepting artificial intelligence, which I found really strange. Since artificial intelligence has only been around, I mean, not Siri, that's just repeating stuff. But artificial intelligence has only been around for a couple of years, and it's been an abysmal failure. All of these chatbots and whatnot, and Chat GPT, um, they're having more and more trouble with it. Um, what else? Oh, I finished the cherries. We came up with 10 plus gallons of cherries. That's 55 pies worth. So there you go. Raspberries. We're done with the raspberry season. I picked about 2.5 gallons. Um, so most of it is in jam. My wife made jam. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Today we're talking about surveys, and there's your PowerPoint. I have no idea why I picked that one. That seems to be the story of my life, doesn't it? Chapter 9 Survey Research. The finger touching the cloud. Shortly after the terrorist attack in New York City and Washington, D.C. in September of 2001, researcher Jennifer Lerner and her colleagues conducted an internet based survey of nearly 2,000 Americans ranging in age from 13 to 88. They asked participants about their reactions to the attacks and for their judgments of various terrorism related and other risks. Among the results were that the participants tended to overestimate most risks, that female participants did so more than male participants, and that there were no differences between teen participants and adult participants. The most interesting result had to do with the fact that some participants were primed to feel anger by asking what made them angry about the attacks and by presenting a photograph, an audio clip intended to evoke anger. Others were primed to feel fear by asking that what made them fearful about the attacks and by presenting a photograph, an audio clip intended to evoke fear. As the researchers hypothesized, the participants who were primed to feel anger perceived less risk than the participants who had been primed to feel fear, showing how risk perceptions are strongly tied to specific emotions. Survey research is a quantitative approach that has two important characteristics. First, the variables of interest are measured using self-reports. Survey researchers ask their participants, who are often called respondents in survey research, to report directly on their own thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Second, considerable attention is paid to the issue of sampling. Survey researchers have a strong preference for large random samples because they provide the most accurate estimates of what is true in the population. Survey research may be the only approach in psychology in which random sampling is routinely used. Anything goes in survey research. Surveys can be long or short. They can be conducted in person, by telephone, through the mail, or over the internet. They can be about voting intentions, consumer preferences, social attitudes, health, or anything else that is possible to ask people about and receive meaningful answers. And the reason I have this picture is because this is from a play, a Broadway play called Anything Goes. Da 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 da. Anything goes. Anyway, that's the song from Anything Goes. Most survey research is non-experimental. It is used to describe single variables, for example, the percentage of voters who prefer one presidential candidate or another, the prevalence of schizophrenia in the general population, and also to assess statistical relationships between variables, for example, the relationship between income and health. But surveys can also be experimental. The study by Lerner and her colleagues is a good example. Their use of self-report measures and a large national sample identifies their work as survey research. But their manipulation of an independent variable, anger versus fear, to assess its effect on the dependent variable, risk judgments, also identifies their work as experimental. English and American social surveys were conducted around the turn of the 20th century by researchers and reformers who wanted to document the extent of social problems such as poverty. Without the surveys, of course, politicians and the very wealthy could claim that they were just speculating, that none of this was true. But by doing the surveys, of course, they could show the statistics and they could show that there was actually a social problem that was taking place, and a lot of it had to do with money. By the 1930s, the U.S. government was conducting surveys to document economic and social conditions in the country. Remember, the stock market crash was in 1929, and we hit the Great Depression, and that went on until World War II. A watershed event was a presidential election of 1936 between Alf Landon and Franklin Roosevelt. If you remember, Roosevelt defeated Hoover in the 1932 election. A magazine called Literary Digest conducted a survey by sending ballots, which were also subscription requests, to millions of Americans. Based on this straw poll, the editors predicted that Landon would win in a landslide. At the same time, the new pollsters were using scientific methods with much smaller samples to predict just the opposite, that Roosevelt would win in a landslide. George Gallup publicly criticized the methods of Literary Digest before the election and all but guaranteed that his prediction would be correct. And of course, it was. Roosevelt won in a landslide. Survey research continues to be important in psychology today. Survey data have been instrumental in estimating prevalence of various mental disorders and identifying statistical relationships among those disorders and with other factors. The National Comorbidity Survey is a large-scale mental health survey conducted in the United States. In just one part of this survey, nearly 10,000 adults were given a structured mental health interview in their homes in 2002 and 2003. This kind of information can be of great use both to basic researchers seeking to understand the causes and correlates of mental disorders, and also to clinicians and policymakers who need to understand exactly how common these disorders are. And as you can see, anxiety is the highest. Mood disorders, probably depression, ADHD, 8% of the population. Oppositional, that's not right. Conduct disorder and oppositional defiant disorder, about 7%. And substance abuse, about 7%. The heart of any survey research project is the survey questionnaire itself. Although it is easy to think of interesting questions to ask people, constructing a good survey questionnaire is not easy at all. The problem is that the answers people give can be influenced in unintended ways by the wording of the items, the order of the items, the response options provided, and many other factors. At best, these influences add noise to the data. At worst, they result in systematic biases and misleading results. There's a cognitive process that people engage in when responding to a survey item. That should be process, not processes. Respondents must interpret the question, retrieve relevant information from memory, form a tentative judgment, convert the tentative judgment into one of the response options provided, for example, rating it on a 1 to 7 scale, which is normally known as a Likert scale, and finally edit their response as necessary. And there you have it right up here. Question interpretation. You have to interpret the question. You have to retrieve the information from your brain. You need to make a judgment on what's going on and how you're going to answer the question. Then you need to format your answer, and then you need to respond. Complexity can lead to unintended influences on respondents' answers. These are often referred to as context effects, an unintended effect of the context in which a response is made. Within subjects' experiments, this can be an effect of being tested in one condition on how participants perceive stimuli or interpret their task, and therefore how they respond in later conditions. In survey research, this can be an effect of the surrounding items or the response scale on the responses to a particular item. There is an item order effect when the order in which the items are presented affects people's responses. One item can change how participants interpret a later item or change their information that they retrieve to respond to later items. Okay, this is really kind of an interesting series of pictures. If you just saw this picture, how would you interpret her facial expression? You might say she's crying. You'd probably say she was crying. And of course, with everybody else laughing, you know that she is laughing. This is what a schizophrenic patient saw when he saw this picture. All he did was focus on her face, but another individual actually looked at both faces, all the faces in the picture, and therefore they would interpret it completely differently. The schizophrenic patient would see this as her crying, probably, and them laughing at her. And the control subject, of course, saw everybody laughing and assumed she was laughing as well. The response options provided can have unintended effects on people's responses. For example, when people are asked how often they are really irritated and given response options ranging from less than once a year to more than once a month, they tend to think of major irritations and report being irritated frequently. But when they are given response options ranging from less than once a day to several times a month, they tend to think of minor irritations and report being irritated frequently. People also tend to assume that middle response options represent what is normal or typical. So if they think of themselves as normal or typical, they tend to choose middle response options. And I have no, I typed in there, what did I type in? Normal responses or something like that. And that's the picture that came up. A video game. Questionnaire items can be either open-ended or closed-ended. Open-ended items simply ask a question and allow participants to answer in whatever way they choose. Open-ended items are useful when researchers do not know how participants might respond or want to avoid influencing their responses. They tend to be used when researchers have more vaguely defined research questions, often in the early stages of a research project. Open-ended items are relatively easy to write because there are no response options to worry about. However, they take more time and effort on the part of participants, and they're more difficult for the researcher to analyze because the answers must be transcribed, coded, and submitted to some form of content analysis. So you need to figure out what they said, and you need to code it so that you're finding out exactly what they mean. Whereas with a a closed-ended question, there's only a very small series of responses that they can make. Much easier to grade, to analyze. Closed-ended questions ask a question that provide a set of response options for participants to choose from. Closed-ended items are used when researchers have a good idea of the different responses that participants might make. They are also used when researchers are interested in well-defined variable or constructs such as participants' level of agreement with some statement, perceptions of risk, or frequency of a particular behavior. Closed-ended items are more difficult to write because they must include an appropriate set of response options. However, they are relatively quick and easy for participants to complete. They are also much easier for researchers to analyze because the responses can be easily converted to numbers and entered into a spreadsheet. For these reasons, closed-ended items are much more common. All closed-ended items include a set of response options from which a participant must choose. For categorical variables like sex, race, or political party preference, the categories are usually listed and participants choose the one or ones that they belong to. For quantitative variables, a rating scale is typically provided. A rating scale is an ordered set of responses that participants must choose from. There you go. Do you like this product? Yes or no? A rough guideline for writing questionnaire items is provided by the Brusso model. They should be brief, relevant, unambiguous, specific, and objective. They stand for brief, relevant, unambiguous, specific, and objective. Somebody didn't edit this very well. Effective questionnaire items are brief and to the point. They avoid long, overly technical, or unnecessary words. This makes them easier for respondents to understand and faster for them to complete. Effective questionnaire items are also relevant to the research question. If a respondent's sexual orientation, marital status, or income is not relevant, then it is best not to ask about it. Again, this makes the questionnaire faster to complete, but it also avoids annoying respondents with what they will rightly perceive as irrelevant or even nosy questions. Don't mind me, I'm just returning your nose. I found it in my business again. Okay, there you go. Effective questionnaire items are also unambiguous. They can be interpreted in only one way, and that's the way I try to make my quizzes. If you if you look at the canned quizzes that they give to instructors, a lot of times they're fairly ambiguous, and for that reason, there's a lot of different ways that you can interpret them. That's something I don't like. That's why I write my own quizzes. Effective questionnaire items are also specific so that it is clear to respondents what their response should be about and clear to researchers what it is about. A common problem here is closed-ended items that are double-barreled. They ask about two conceptually separate issues but allow only one response. Effective questionnaire items are objective in the sense that they do not reveal the researcher's own opinions or lead participants to answer in a particular way. For closed-ended items, it is also important to create an appropriate response scale. For categorical variables, the categories presented should generally be mutually exclusive and exhaustive. Mutually exclusive categories do not overlap. In many cases, it is not feasible to include every possible category, in which case an other category with a space for the respondent to fill in a more specific response is a good solution. If respondents could belong to more than one category, for example, race, they should be instructed to choose all categories that apply. For rating scales, 5 or 7 response options generally allow about as much precision as respondents are capable of. However, numerical scales with more options can sometimes be appropriate. For dimensions such as attractiveness, pain, and likelihood, a 0 to 10 scale will be familiar to many respondents and easy for them to use. Regardless of the number of response options, the most extreme ones should generally be balanced around a neutral or modal midpoint. A middle or neutral response option does not have to be included. So researchers sometimes choose to leave it out because they want to encourage respondents to think more deeply about their response and not simply choose the middle option by default. Every survey questionnaire should have a written or spoken introduction that serves two basic functions. One is to encourage respondents to participate in the survey. In many types of research, such encouragement is not necessary, either because participants do not know that they are in a study, as in the naturalistic observation, or because they are part of a subject pool that have already shown their willingness to participate by signing up and showing up for the study. Survey research usually catches respondents by surprise when they check their phone, go to their mailbox, or check their email. And the researcher must make a good case for why they should agree to participate. Thus, the introduction should briefly explain the purpose of the survey and its importance, provide information about the sponsor of the survey, acknowledge the importance of the respondent's participation, and describe any incentives for participating. In other words, you need to make it look as pretty as you possibly can, like a rainbow. Squidward. The second function of the introduction is to establish informed consent. This means describing to respondents everything that might affect their decision to participate. This includes the topics covered by the survey, the amount of time it is likely to take, the respondent's option to withdraw at any time, confidentiality issues, and so on. Separate written consent forms are not typically used in survey research, so it is important that this part of the introduction be well documented and presented clearly and in its entirety to every respondent. That's a huge consent form. The introduction should be followed by a substantive questionnaire items, but first it is important to present clear instructions for completing the questionnaire, including examples of how to use any unusual response scales. Remember that this is the point at which respondents are usually most interested and least fatigued. So it is good practice to start with the most important items for purposes of the research and proceed to less important items. Items should also be grouped by topic or by type. Demographic items are often presented last because they are least interesting to participants, but also easy to answer in the event respondents have become tired or bored. Of course, any survey should end with an expression of appreciation to the respondents. Thank you. There you go. All psychological research involves sampling, selecting a sample to study from the population of interest. Sampling falls into two broad categories. Probability sampling occurs when the researcher can specify the probability that each member of the population will be selected for the sample. Non-probability sampling occurs when the researcher cannot specify these probabilities. Most psychological research involves non-probability sampling. Convenience sampling, studying individuals who happen to be nearby and willing to participate, is a very common form of non-probability sampling used in psychological research. Compared with non-probability sampling, probability sampling requires a very clear specification of the population, which of course depends on the research questions to be answered. The population might be all registered voters in the state of Arkansas, all American consumers who have purchased a car in the past year, women in the United States over 40 years old who have received a mammogram in the past decade, or all the alumni of a particular university. Once the population has been specified, probability sampling requires a sampling frame. This is essentially a list of all the members of the population from which to select the respondents. Sampling frames can come from a variety of sources, including telephone directories, lists of registered voters, and hospital or insurance records. In some cases, a map can serve as a sampling frame, allowing for the selection of cities, streets, or households. There are a variety of different probability sampling methods. Simple random sampling is done in such a way that each individual in the population has an equal probability of being selected for the sample. Conceptually, this is like putting the names of all individuals in the sampling frame into a box, mixing them up, and then drawing out the number needed for the sample. Given the most sampling frames take the form of computer files, random sampling is more likely to involve computerized sorting or selection of respondents. An alternative to simple random sampling is stratified random sampling, in which the population is divided into different subgroups or strata, usually based on demographic characteristics, and then a random sample is taken from each stratum. Stratified random sampling can be used to select a sample in which the proportion of the respondents in each of the various subgroups matches the proportion in the population. Yet another type of probability sampling is cluster sampling, in which larger clusters of individuals are randomly sampled, and then individuals within each cluster are randomly sampled. For example, to select a sample of small town residents in the United States, a researcher might randomly select several small towns and then randomly select several individuals within each town. Cluster sampling is especially useful for surveys that involve face-to-face interviewing because it minimizes the amount of traveling that the interviewers must do. The size of a survey sample depends on two factors. One is the level of confidence in the result that the researcher wants. The larger the sample, the closer any statistic based on that sample will tend to be to the corresponding value in the population. The other factor is the budget of the study. Larger samples provide greater confidence, but they take more time, effort, and money to obtain. Taking these two factors into account, most survey research uses sample sizes that range from about 100 to about 1,000. Probability sampling was developed in a large part to address the issue of sampling bias. Sampling bias occurs when a sample is selected in such a way that it is not representative of the entire population and therefore produces inaccurate results. This was the reason that the Literary Digest straw poll was so far off in its prediction of the 1936 presidential election. The mailing list came largely from telephone directories and lists of registered automobile owners, which overrepresented wealthier people who were more likely to vote for Landon. Gallup was successful because he knew about this bias and found ways to sample less wealthy people as well. Okay, so here's the question. Yes, I love responding to surveys. No, I toss them in the bin. And yes, I love responding to surveys. It was 98.8%. And the people that didn't like it were 0.2%. We received 500 responses and found that people love responding to surveys. And this is sampling bias. Why? Because people who don't enjoy responding to surveys aren't going to respond to the survey. Oh, man. There is one form of sampling bias that even careful random sampling is subject to. It is almost never the case that everyone selected for the sample actually responds to the survey. Some may have died or moved away, and others may decline to participate because they are too busy, they're not interested in the survey topic, or they do not participate in surveys on principle. If these survey non-responders differ from the survey responders in the systematic ways, then this can produce non-response biases. And you're going to always have non-response biases in just about any survey that you do. So it's going to skew it more toward the positive than toward the negative. Because people that don't like it will just not fill out the survey. And that gives, but the people that like it will fill out the survey. So the vast majority of people who you get to respond are people that like to fill out surveys. So they'll think more positively, and you won't get as many negative responses as you should be getting. The best approach to minimizing non-response bias is to minimize the number of non-responders. That is, to maximize the response rate. In general, in-person interviews have the highest response rates, followed by telephone surveys, and then mail and internet surveys. Among the other factors that increase response rates are sending potential respondents a short pre-notification message informing them that they will be asked to participate in a survey in the near future, and sending simple follow-up reminders to non-responders after a few weeks. The perceived length and complexity of the survey also makes a difference, which is why it is important to keep survey questionnaires as short and on topic as possible. Offering an incentive, especially cash, is a reliable way to increase response rates. The four main ways to conduct surveys are through in-person interviews, by telephone, through the mail, and over the internet. As with other aspects of survey design, the choice depends on both the researcher's goals and the budget. In-person interviews have the highest response rates and provide the closest personal contact with respondents. Personal contact can be important when the interviewer must see and make judgments about respondents, as is the case with some mental health interviews. But in-person interviewing is by far the most costly approach. Telephone surveys have lower response rates and still provide some personal contact with the respondents. They can also be costly but are generally less so than in-person interviews. Mail surveys are less costly still, but generally have even lower response rates, making them most susceptible to non-response bias. Not surprisingly, internet surveys are becoming more common. They are increasingly easy to construct and use. They make initial contact by email with a link directly to the survey. SurveyMonkey is one of these canned survey companies. They make it very easy to create an internet survey. This can work well when the population consists of the members of an organization who have known email addresses and regularly use them, for example, a university community. For other populations, it can be difficult or impossible to find a comprehensive list of email addresses to serve as a sampling frame. Alternatively, a request to participate in the survey with a link to it can be posted in websites known to be visited by members of the population. Because of their low cost and because more people are online than ever before, internet surveys are becoming the dominant approach to survey data collection. And that is the end of the lecture. Just like what we saw in the social psych website, you all participated in social psych research. Most of them were surveys, surveys that you filled out. So there you go. Okay. So I will talk to you again next week.